Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, planet, profit. Now that most of the harvest across Cornelius country is complete, let's jump right in and talk to our lead agronomist, Craig Allaman, and get some of his post-harvest thoughts. Craig, let's start with the beginning of the season and talk about corn emergence. Are there any events that took place that caused concern for you?
Well, thanks for the question. As we talk about the 2020 growing season and kind of what has happened throughout the year, and now as we're seeing harvest results, I do like to go back to kind of the beginning there. And if we wouldn't have had the big wind events and then the grain field drought that we had this year, I think the biggest event that would have affected our corn crop anyway was the cold conditions shortly after emergence, during emergence, soon after we planted. We did have some ultra early planting at the first couple weeks in April down in the further southern geographies. We had snow, cool conditions on that. Some of that was replanted. The issues we would have expected occurred, but we had a fair amount, what I would call normal planting time frames, the end of April, first part of May, where we did also plant into some cool soils, especially further north in our northern geographies. And we did see, as we went and monitored that emergence and the early growth, we did see some detrimental effects there. And then also we had that Mother's Day weekend event, which was I'd call it a frost or freeze event. There were areas where we had a pretty hard freeze on that. And, even planting that occurred within a week of that event, we saw some detrimental effects and did have some replant there. But the things that we see and that we noticed, we're going to have real emergence issues, a lot of late emergers, some loss in stand. And those can come from a variety of things. I mean, you can have imbibition injury, so that chilling effect right after you plant when that seed is absorbing that first amount of water. It can just injure the cells inside that embryo and cause damage there to the point where it won't even come out of the seed at all. Or you can have varying degrees of cold injury, up until the time where really the plant is out of the ground. We can still injure that plant pretty good with cold injury. So when we went around and looked at a lot of corn during that V3 to V5 stage, we did see a lot of these effects, a lot of those late emergers. And, you've heard people always talk about, well, if that plant comes out 2, 3, 4 days after the rest of them, it's just a weed. Well, why is it just a weed? I mean, there's no reason other than the fact that that plant was injured to the point where it won't put an ear on later on. Now, that could happen with just the cold injury itself, or a lot of times in cool, wet soils, we'll get nailed by Pythium or Fusarium. Pythium's probably the worst in our geography. And so, I think we saw a lot of that this year as well. But when we looked at these fields and saw a lot of that uneven emergence all the way across eastern Iowa into western Illinois, we were thinking at the time we were going to have some yield drag from that, because some of those real late plants probably wouldn't put on an ear, or if they did, it'd be pretty good nubbing. The problem with that is we forget that a lot of times. So when we get here, we're sitting here in the combine this time of the year, and we're harvesting the field, and we're a little disappointed with it. We see some variability in yield. Sometimes we don't remember back to what happened, earlier in the season. So it's important to remember that, and I think that's one of several things this year that will explain some of the variability in the yields that kind of surprise us this time of the year. But when we think back, we're like, a little cool conditions were tough there. Wet areas in the field. We still pay for compaction in the last couple of years that maybe we haven't really got out of the fields yet with tillage. Especially the challenge of tillage last year, as late as the year was. It was wet. We did our best, but it wasn't ideal by any means. So I think, pretty easily, I think we could have could have taken 10 to 20 bushel off the top end in some of these fields that were really heavily affected by some of these cool conditions after emergence. And one of the most exciting things in that area, Syngenta has a new fungicide that's not registered yet, but we hope maybe the first quarter of this coming year to get that registered. But regardless, that will be part of our package moving forward, just our standard package of fungicides. And this is a real step change, this new fungicide in the control of Pythium. So I just think that's something that we've needed for a long time, and that's just going to be a real benefit and a real value to our corn seed moving forward. So thanks again for the question. I hope that sums up that topic.
It does, Craig. Thank you. You mentioned that cool weather early on having a yield drag on some of that ultra early planted crop. Since we're talking yield drag, naturally, a big one we think about is that inland hurricane we had in August that the weather folks call the derecho. But I don't think we should move on to that just yet. Is there anything else that happened in between that's easy to overlook because of the impact we felt from those 100+ mile an hour winds?
You're right. We can't move on to the derecho yet. That obviously being the biggest event that affected us during the year, because we really got to work in chronological order here, and we need to stop and talk about that event that occurred in mostly in the second week in July. We had a week there where we had at least 4 separate wind events that caused some pretty severe damage to our corn crop across a pretty wide area in our geography. All up and down that eastern Iowa and that western Illinois, kind of on each side of the Mississippi River, definitely up into that southwest Wisconsin, northeast Iowa area as well. We had some winds that I would say were just at a catastrophic timing for us, and we were just getting ready to tassel. Some areas, there were a few tassels starting to shoot out there, but we were right at a really, really critical timing and a really susceptible timing to get wind. The brace roots, we were out scouting fields that week, looking at a lot of plots and evaluating new hybrids. And one thing that we noticed is the brace roots were out, but they were not anchored by any means. They were just at the soil surface at that time frame. So when we had that wind, we have a fully developed plant. It's tall, wide leaves. Just beautiful growing conditions and a beautiful crop. So we've got a lot of sail there to catch that wind. And we had some pretty severe lodging in those areas. And when we get lodging, of a full-size plant like that, one thing you might as well figure is you've ripped some roots out. It's not going to go over that far without doing some damage to the root system. Those are roots that we would have really liked to have had later on during that grain-filled drought period time. And no doubt did some pretty good yield damage because of that. But also, even 2 to 3 weeks or even a week ahead of that, if we would have had that kind of lodging, we probably would have did a lot better job of that plant coming back upright. When we're getting into that stage, we don't have a lot of elasticity left in that stalk. So instead of goosenecking at that second or third node up and coming mostly upright, a lot of these plants goosenecked, at 4, 5, 6 nodes up, and so they were really into that next row over by the time they came up, and they stayed that way through the rest of the year. Worse than that even is we had a lot of green snap at that time of the year. So, early green snap will occur V5 to V8 when we have rapid cell elongation, the plant's really brittle. And then again, we've got a late period from that V12 to tassel. So since we weren't just at that tassel stage yet, we were still pretty susceptible for green snap. Now, most of the green snap we see in the big areas of injury, are done at what we consider a normal place in the plant. And that's that, bottom 2, 3 nodes. It just snaps off. That plant's gone. The positive part of it, if it's fairly consistent through the field, is you don't have a competing plant left out there. So ears on either side of that snapped off plant can go ahead and flex out a little bit. You can gain some yield back there. In the worst areas of this storm, you had to scout with a drone to get a decent count for the insurance on it. There was enough snapped off, and it was just in streaks across the field. So probably about as bad of green snap overall event as I've seen. But I've started to see this over the last 3, 4, 5 years. To me, it's a newer phenomenon. May have happened earlier, and I just wasn't real aware of it. But plenty of snapping right at the ear. So that dominant ear was already there, already determined, because we were just ready to tassel. And in some cases, I have pictures, where their ear was out and had a little silk on it even. And it snapped that plant off either right at that ear node or the next node above it. So you've got that ear at the top of the plant, that top ear is already determined. These plants did not go ahead and initiate an ear below that. So the decisions were already made. And as I've seen in the past, because I've seen this in the past, we went out and revisited these fields in the August time frame, say mid-August, and most of those plants did not go ahead and support that ear. They just aborted it. The ones that did, it was a pretty nubbin ear at that point in time. So some pretty bad damage from that storm, and again, it was pretty widespread. If it wouldn't have been for the derecho, that would have been probably our big event for the year. And I think pretty easily from the fields I have followed that had the worst damage, somewhere between a 20 and 70 bushel yield hit from that storm, depending on how severe it was. And so it was a pretty tough event. Again, right ahead of that, probably as good of a corn crop as I've ever seen. We were so clean. We had no disease. Our leaves were green clear to the ground, telling that we had ample nutrients, ample water, ample nitrogen at the right time of the year. So we were looking at a pretty fantastic crop before that hit. But again, thanks for the question, and that's just another piece of the puzzle for 2020.
With that being said, it's safe to say that we can move on to that obvious puzzle piece. Craig, something like the derecho is a once-in-a-lifetime event, particularly across Cornelius country. Is there anything that we can learn from the derecho event?
How did I know that question was coming next? Yeah, we are at the point where we hit the derecho. There in that second week in August. We talked about the wind events from that second week in July. Paled in comparison, of course. And, what we all feel about this is just, compassion for you guys that went through it. There's a big area of Cornelius country that saw those winds, but that central part of Iowa, starting on the other side of Des Moines and, running well east of Cedar Rapids, just took the brunt of it. And I know a lot of us have toured that. It was just devastating. Unfortunately, an event like that, or fortunately, however you look at it, I don't know that there's much you learn from it because it was so unprecedented, and hopefully we won't see it again. Who can remember a wind event like that? And of course, they had to have a special name for it. It was such an unprecedented event. But a lot of those fields got tilled under in the thought process at the time when the insurance gave the okay that they were pretty much destroyed. Was that they wanted to do the best job they could because we had fully developed ears. I mean, those ears were developed, and the germ would have been good on the seed. But get that tilled back into the soil, hopefully germinate, those seeds so that we have, have fields that aren't just overrun with volunteer corn next year. So that's kind of the angle on that. And again, I don't know that there's anything we can pull out hybrids management programs with a wind like that. It was just an act of nature. But it did probably affect soybeans. It came through pretty decent. We probably lodged the beans enough that we probably took some top end off of them as well. But the only thing I would say that just the diversity of your operation, where you have corn and soybeans, and an event like that doesn't affect the beans near as much as it did the corn, and at least you still have some crop there. But what we just hope is that everybody came out of that, hopefully between insurance, disaster payments, and things like that everybody's made as close to whole as possible and able to fight another year. So very unfortunate event, and we sure feel for the people that have went through it.
Unfortunate indeed, Craig. Now, Let's talk about continuous corn. As you know, right now we're in that time of year where we're all analyzing and digesting harvest and plot data, both from our profit plots and from independent studies like those performed by the folks over at First Trials and Iowa State University and several others, followed by all the events that you've talked about. I think it's safe to say that we've seen yield take a hit across continuous corn. What are some of those issues, and how should we best manage a corn on corn program?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, especially. I think, we've had a couple of years in a row now where continuous corn has really taken it on the chin with yield in pretty decent sized areas of our geography. And so I want to talk about that a little bit because, continuous corn is still a very viable option. And, our customers make decisions to plant continuous corn because it makes economic sense for them. We always like to raise corn, but we don't raise it just for the fun of it. If it makes sense in our operations, we need to do it. So, I think our job is just to be there alongside you with good advice on how to best manage that program. And there's some things we can do and some things we can tweak and things we kind of need to remember that we can learn from. So, in 2020, we have had rootworm pressure goes in cycles. It always has. The population crashes and then it builds back up, and we're at a period of time here where it's getting pretty serious across a pretty decent part of our geography. Especially kind of that Dubuque area across to the I-39 area. That's a pretty good band in there where it's pretty heavy. Northwest Illinois, we've got some pretty heavy pressures. So we kind of need to take a step back and remember what we've done in the past when we've had heavy pressure. And, there's been some documented cases of resistance to traded rootworm products. So that is out there, and we need to be aware of that. It's one of the reasons why we use a pyramid product like a Smart Stack that has at least two modes of action on corn rootworm. So if we have resistance to one, hopefully the other is killing that before it has a chance to reproduce. But heavy rootworm pressure has always overcome the traits. That it's not a magic bullet. It's not a high dose product like our corn borer traits. Corn borer traits, we're pretty used to that, killing pretty much 100% corn borer with no damage to the plant. And it will do that, but corn rootworm has never been that. So until we have an event that is a higher dose event, we're always going to have some feeding on the plant. And when you have high pressure, it will just overwhelm the trait. And, there's just going to be enough larvae get through and feed on that we're going to have some pretty severe damage. So one thing we do when we get to that point where we've got that rootworm pressure built to that kind of a level is if we're continuous corn and we're using the traded product, we also want to use an insecticide. Okay, because we just need to kill more larvae than we're going to be able to do with the trait. And of course, if we're using conventional corn, we're doing that anyway. And I'm talking, it needs to be one of the good products at a full rate. So we're talking, an Aztec or a Force, generally speaking. So, that's one thing that we need to be doing. The drought is what you get rootworm pressure, that's bad enough. But anytime you compromise your root system and you follow that with a grain-filled drought, you're going to have big yield issues like we saw this year. And continuous corn in a drought where we've had root feeding can be up to 100 bushel less than corn on soybeans. I mean, it just will. And even you got to remember, even if you get good efficacy out of your Force or your Aztec, that's only going to protect so deep. So, if those rootworm larvae are feeding under that zone where you've protected, and if they're so heavy they're taking all those roots off, you get a drought situation and you're in trouble. Okay, so you can have good control of the root system and not have nodes totally eaten back and still have issues there. So, that's the risk you take, and that when you grow continuous corn and you don't have years like that very often. Outside of the droughty area in northern Iowa, we got along just fine with our continuous corn programs like we always have. But we just need to be aware that pressure has built back up. It's very heavy, and we need to manage it accordingly. The other thing I would say for continuous corn is, continuous corn is a multiple stress environment. I mean, you have issues with dealing with heavy residue, and then the residue, the microbes tying up your nitrogen that are breaking that residue down. So you're behind the eight ball from the get-go, and then you've got diseases that are going to be overwintering in your corn residue. So you're going to have heavier gray leaf spot, heavier northern corn leaf blight, now tar spot possibly. So, there's a lot of issues going against you. And I still think that a planned application of a fungicide at tasseling time frame, right in that area, is just really important for continuous corn, and will really pay you a big return. Okay, because it just takes one of those stresses away, controls those diseases, gets us better standability, keeps us a little healthier, a little bit longer during that grain fill period. So I just think that's an important step in continuous corn. But we lost probably anywhere from your normal. I mean, you normally probably look at a 10% drop in continuous corn. That doesn't always happen. There's years that it doesn't, but because of all those factors we talked about, a 5-10% drop is not unheard of, and we saw up to 100 bushel, I think, this year in those worst droughty areas with continuous corn. So, don't give up the program. Just be aware of that we're in the situation we're in with rootworm pressure. If insurance is a factor, making sure that you get those continuous corn acres insured differently, however you can do it. It's just all part of the management program. Not a system we need to give up on, because again, if it's paying economics for you and your program, it's just something that we'd like to help you with, and we do that through recommending the right hybrids and bringing you the tools for protection that we can, and just kind of being there with you, helping you make those decisions during years like this where we have higher pressure. So thanks again for the question. It's an important topic, and it's one that we're going to continue to do. And we grow great corn across the area that we cover. It's definitely one of our strengths, and we'll continue to do that.
Thanks, Craig. We've talked about emergence issues and those wind events and continuous corn issues knocking down our yields. But in some of Cornelius country, we've seen yield maps taking a hit on the edge of fields. Is that new? What's going on, and what can you tell us? There's certainly something interesting going on there.
Yeah, you're correct. We do have kind of a new interesting issue to talk about this year. It's not exactly new, and it may actually be not new at all. But we've had a lot of yield maps come in where we've seen an edge effect on the corn, and by an edge effect I mean reduced yield, usually on the south edge of a cornfield, and sometimes on the west. You can see it on any side, but those are the predominant sides that we're seeing. We actually, in 2017, across Iowa, saw this also. And Iowa State, I know they had a publication on it, talking about it a little bit. Couple of scenarios that they think may be going on. They're actually doing a test. They're doing on-farm testing in 2020 on this very issue. So hopefully sometime later this fall or into the winter, we're going to get some results from Iowa State on this issue. But what they thought in 2017 is we could be seeing on those southern sides or the western, and then normally it's where there's a soybean field that's adjacent to a cornfield. They don't see it nearly as much where there's a cornfield adjacent to another cornfield. So one school of thought is, well, maybe we're having herbicide drift. And of course, we've been using dicamba, so that would be a logical direction to look. Are we getting dicamba sprayed on these beans later than when we would normally spray it on corn, so past a V stage that is labeled? Are we getting that drifting into the edge of those cornfields and causing some injury? The thing that kind of puts the kibosh on that a little bit is we also see this where there's pastures on the south or CRP or something like that. So we wouldn't expect to have herbicide drift coming out of that or those type of areas. So the second thing is that they're looking at, and they're kind of focusing their efforts on the study they did in 2020 is, well, we have predominant either south or southwest winds all summer, and the warm winds during the summer months. And so are we just simply drying out those southern edges, and causing, more of a droughty effect, for lack of a better term, on those edges of the fields? And is that why we're seeing that yield drag? And so, if you think about it, you've got those warm southern winds coming through there, so they simply drying that out, and as it goes further in the field, you've got corn acting as a windbreak for the rest of the field, so you wouldn't have as much of that wind. But also, as that corn transpires, so it's letting off moisture to cool itself down in the summer, and as it transpires and that moisture comes up, the wind comes into those southern edges, picks that moisture up, and as it advances on through the field, it's a much moister wind that's not drying out the rest of that field as much. So that's kind of the school of thought that they're checking into, and that would also be why we don't see it as much when we have a cornfield adjacent, because number one, that cornfield is acting as a windbreak to the other cornfield north of it, but also as that wind comes across that cornfield, it's picking up moist air from the transpiration, and it's not as dry of a wind as it gets to that field. So that's what they're looking at. They're growing in maybe a couple 100 feet, various stages, various intersects in there, and they're having, the measuring the temperature, measuring the relative humidity, and then they also have light reflective sensors in there too to see what's going on there and measure that, kind of add a piece to the puzzle. So anyway, hopefully that'll be something this winter through meetings, and I'm sure there'll be publications online on that. We'll definitely forward them to all of you, and something interesting to learn. And like I said, this could have been going on forever. I mean, we're seeing it now because everybody's using yield monitors, and you got these maps, and it just kind of really pops up, but this could have been going on since the beginning of corn growing across the Midwest, and we just now we're kind of noticing it. So once we do, are we going to be able to do anything for it? That's a good question. I mean, if it's just wind, I'm not sure exactly what we would do for it, but at least we will figure out why. Well, we have a lot of red showing up on the southern edge of our maps, and we always want to know in case there is something that we can do. So very good question, and very interesting topic, and again, hopefully we'll learn more this winter.
I agree. It sure is an interesting topic, and we're looking forward to that info and learning more to see if this is a new phenomenon, or like you said, it's something that's been going on all along, and we're just now really seeing, given all of the new technology in our fields. Now, I feel like we've talked a lot about corn, but we can't forget about soybeans. In 2019, as you know, it was a very wet year, and for those areas that had more activity, we saw some stressful looking beans. What did you see, and how are things looking for 2020 soybeans?
You are absolutely correct. We never want to forget the soybeans. Soybeans are a very important part of our customers' profitability and an important part of their program, and have just continued to be a more valuable crop, and it's been exciting that we're kind of increasing the yields on soybeans exponentially in the last few years, and have a lot of new tools with weed control for them, and maybe some value-added tools down the road. We'll start maybe get some insect resistance and things like that, like we've done in corn. So I want to spend a little time talking about what we saw with the soybean crop this year, and kind of just like corn, if you'd asked me at the end of June, at early July, before we started getting some wind events and things like that, I would have told you this is the best looking soybean crop across a wide geography that I've ever seen. I mean, beans visually were just beautiful. We as an industry, our customers have hit that. They pay very close attention to what they can do each year to improve their operation, and everybody has picked up on this early planting soybean window. And we just as an industry, we just hit that mark hard this year. A ton of soybeans went in early. I would say most of the beans went in early, and the reason is because we've been seeing a nice yield bump by doing that, and there's no cost in it. It's just a management practice. So what we know about that early planting is it gets us to hit that early flowering window on the front side of the summer solstice instead of the back, and that's key to put more nodes on and increasing those yields. So we hit that across a large majority of our fields this year. I saw a lot of beans flowering in that early part of June, by mid-June, rather than late June, early July, like we have seen normally in the past. So we were trucking right along, just a visually clean crop, not a lot of stress. Emergence was good, early growth was good. When we started putting pods on, we were heavily podded. I mean, we were just really cranking with the beans. Yield events, especially the derecho, when you lodge beans in August, that bean needs to be into full reproductive at that stage. All the energy needs to be going in the seed. When you lodge them, sometimes they will kick back into vegetative mode, start growing, sticking on new nodes out the top of the plant when they should be spending that energy on just filling those pods. So we probably saw some impact from that, but the big impact, of course, was the drought during the grain fill period. And anybody that's ever raised soybeans knows that you've got to have rain in August to have a big soybean yield. Now, after saying that, we've experienced 2 years in a row with really poor precipitation in August, and we're raising some pretty decent beans in the face of that. I think the question is, how big would the crop have been if we would have had just one good rain event in that mid-August time frame? Because we're pulling down some 70 bushel beans this year in places. I mean, we're definitely seeing that, but we're seeing a lot of 50 bushel beans as well in those worst droughty areas. We should. I think a 50 bushel yield in those areas where we had 5-6 weeks of no rainfall right during that critical period of time is still pretty darn good soybeans, and that probably is a testament to the pod count that we had and that early planning and how we had things set up. So still pretty good yields there. In those areas where we're getting in the 70s yielding this year, what would they have been if we would have had rain? I mean, I think they clearly would have been significantly higher yielding than that, which is pretty exciting. So, I think pretty easily we could be looking, with that lack of rainfall in August, a 10 to 20 bushel yield hit, I think is very realistic. So, you tack that on to whatever your beans made, and I think that's what could have been this year. Not as many factors affected the beans. That early planting on the beans, where we had a lot of corn injured and no doubt we lost yield, does not seem to affect beans to the extent that it does corn. Now it could. I mean, you have risk there, and we had replant situations where we froze beans off with that Mother's Day event, but we were still fairly timely getting that replant planted, so that takes away some of the risk, and crop insurance and things like that helps on the replant as well. So I guess what I'm saying is, if soil conditions are really good and the calendar maybe is a little early or it's a little chilly yet for corn, I am not afraid at all to go out there and start getting beans put in the ground, and then maybe wait till a little bit more advantageous temperature range, coming up for the corn to get planted. So I think it's a nice option to have, and I think we've proven it pretty good. We've had several years now. We've gotten by with the early planning, and I think we've kind of moved into where it's just a program that we'll use. So pretty exciting there, and definitely didn't want to finish without talking soybeans. Again, they're a very, very important part of our production here in the Midwest, and they have been pretty exciting in the last several years with the increases we've made in yield. So thanks again. I always appreciate getting to visit with everybody, just kind of thoughts on what we've seen out there through the year. We've got some exciting new products that we've looked at for next year, and we'll spend the next 2-3 months, Will on the soybeans, and Chuck and James and I on the corn, and that's always a fun time of the year, and we're very excited about the new crop that we selected last year. Everything seemed to come through.
Everything did come through like you guys expected it would in the trials, and I know the team's excited with a nice selection of new products that we have for our growers, and we're really looking forward to that. I'm afraid that is all the time we have, Craig, and we very much appreciate your post-harvest thoughts. To our listeners, I want to thank you again for joining and spending part of your day with us. We would like to invite you to subscribe to this podcast so that you can get notified when we post a new episode. You can expect regular episodes to launch January in 2021 and every 2 weeks thereafter. In the meantime, please visit our website by going to www.corneliusseed.com and check out some of our performance data. Thank you again for listening, and continue to keep safe during harvest.